Yeah. Come on in. Take a seat. Let's talk about light novels for a bit. I know my tone has changed, but God, we're 5 videos in and I can't be bothered to keep that up anymore, so this is what you're stuck with. You're here, I've read the light novels, you're looking for spoilers for the upcoming anime season. Or to hear my thoughts on the franchise? That's good for a laugh. So let's get into it, the long-awaited Volume 7 video, where all the build-up since Volume 4 is finally going to amount to something. Just a reminder, before we go ahead and settle on into this video, the spoiler warnings reached a fever pitch. What we're looking at today is most likely going to be the climax and conclusion for the next season. Now, if that doesn't deter you, or heaven forbid you have no clue what I'm talking about, go ahead and click the playlist in the upper right-hand corner. That should catch you up to speed. Also, maybe subscribe for some more light novel content from me, I guess. I've been meaning to do more plugs like that, but I just honestly can't be bothered. Man, I am such a great YouTuber. But for now, let's dive into the plot of this volume. And that was seriously your last chance. Get the fuck out if you don't want to be spoiled on the conclusion to Season 2. Picking up where we last left off with, Volume 6 ended on the middling note that everyone's incompetent, but the war could possibly end through an intermediary, that being, Ildoa. But there's a small hiccup there. That being the 2 main antagonistic forces against the Empire aren't quite ready to throw in the towel, so one last big victory is needed to tip the scale. Tanya, finally done being flung around the Empire and the former alliance, is back on the Eastern Front where spring has settled in, leading Visha's prediction to come true, that the front would turn into a muddy hellscape. She kinda knew from experience, right? Tanya's mission is to get to the forwardmost line, but good luck with that, when everything looks the damn same and maps aren't up to date. For reference, she's out with the battalion because the conf group is slow, so they're hanging back. Plus, the Empire's lines are crumbling from the Federation counterattack, so they're already aiming for a moving target, which is just a drawn-out way of saying they're lost and looking for someone to fight. And of course, you all know Tanya by this point. She wants to pull out, but she can't, because that's against orders. So some mages pop up, actual Federation mages, signaling Loria's plan to get them out of the camps is in full force, at least aside from the multinational unit. And these bastards are a tough bunch, because even though she's blowing them out of the sky left and right with Type 95, more keep coming. Wow, human wave tactics on the Eastern Front? Who'd have thought? They find out their weakness is getting up close and personal, because the Federation mages are fairly green and lack training. So just get in there and slice them up with your bayonet. She has an argument with some random mage about who God is actually with, because this is your once every few books reminder that Type 95 corrupts Tanya's mind. But eventually they mop them up, and it's hinted that Tanya fighting Type 95's influences gives her a nasty headache. Foreshadowing? Hard to tell. Tanya doesn't really use the Type 95 all that often, so who knows? They bail after that fight, and Tanya sends Grants out for some scouting on the return trip to find some friendlies, so here she remarks how far he's come from being a crybaby on the Rhine. Now he's pretty competent. Good for him. After seeing all the waste on the front with vehicles abandoned and the Federation slowly moving in, Tanya's pretty pissed. The first chapter of this book amounts to a brief action scene and a collective shrug from those in charge saying they don't know anything, so kinda sharing in her sentiment at this point. But they meet up with a friendly unit on the front where we get introduced to Colonel Dirischle, a man with a name, so you know he's important. But Tanya likes him because he seems competent. They take the battalion to a single house that's not blown out by artillery, that's functioning as their command. Wow, I wonder what that ominous shadow hanging over this scene is. I'm sure it's nothing. They catch each other up, Tanya learns where their command post is, and also learns that the lines are a shit show, which we already knew but wasn't explicitly stated. So way to do show not tell and then tell anyway to make sure we're all on the same page. Excellent writing. Tanya is asked and willing to help Dirischle do recon to get some intel on where the enemy is, so they can have an organized retreat and meet up with HQ. So after that little chat, she grabs the battalion to get some food before heading out. That is until she hears the unmistakable sound of artillery shells flying through the air. And PTSD kicking in right here. She and the entire battalion hit the deck. She yells at her troops to get ready and looks over at the command she had just been in with good old Colonel Dirischle, which is now just a crater. Who could have seen that coming? Tanya tries and fails to snap the dumbfounded troops into shape quickly so that they can fight off the incoming Federation infantry, but it falls to the 203rd to do all the lifting. When all those stupid troops try to flee, Tanya gives them a glimpse of Volume 1 Tanya when she prompts the 203rd to take aim at their allies for disobeying orders, which gets the idiot infantry she's dealing with to actually fight. Good for them. I also want to point out that this is the author using Tanya's girlishness again. She's doing all this terrible shit like threatening her fellow troops with death to get them to fight, but she's making a show of it by pouting like a little kid. I mean, I guess it's not inconsistent, but it's just a little odd when the author chooses which aspect of a child he wants to focus on with Tanya. But also, I guess it is kind of inconsistent, because while they don't listen to her at first, this little child waving a gun is suddenly intimidating. And if you remember in the last 2 books, Tanya was anything but. And, before that, on the Rhine, she was the scariest thing her troops had ever seen. Which is it? That's kind of my point. Is she intimidating, or isn't she? And I feel like these moments are only added because through all the capitalism, anti-theism, and random military trivia peppered in Tanya's character, people often forget that she's a little girl. Hell, there's times I forget she's a little girl in this series. And I've been reading it for 7 volumes now. Anyway, after that threatening pep talk, they mop up the Federation attack, and Tanya agrees to be the rear guard for the retreating infantry regiment she just saved. And hey, we have another flash forward here, where they're interviewing veterans of the war about the Lurgan Kampf group, and how legendary it was. Yeah, that sounds weird, right? And kind of interesting that the general staff will be deploying its own members as Kampf group commanders. Don't get your hopes up though, it's a sham. Back to the past, or present for the story, sorry, where the rest of the Kampf group rejoins Tanya at long last. Other than that, get ready for more of the same from the first chapter, where Tanya keeps getting surprised by the Federation, scrambles her troops, barely fends them off, and calls it a day. However, not long into this routine, Tanya is visited by Lurgan himself on the front. He pulls her aside so it's just the 2 of them, and she catches him up to speed on the front because, honestly, it's a rare opportunity for someone with actual influence to see what's happening out there firsthand. Like he's seeing how troublesome the Federation tanks are. With their, super thick armor, mages can't pierce easily, and they basically need to rethink tank engagement doctrine from the ground up. But the real reason he's there isn't to see the front, but to ask Tanya to do him a solid. Calandro from Ildo is going to be observing the Eastern Front, and he wants to stick him with Tanya for 2 key reasons. 1, he'll see the reality of the actual hell the front is, and 2, well, he'll be safest with her. She refuses because that's a tall order and she doesn't want it to bite her in the ass. Oh hey, look at that, she actually does learn her lessons. But also it'll muck up her command structure having a higher ranking foreign officer in the mix. Lurgan tells her that there's already been some changes. Her entire Kampf group has been reassigned to the Lurgan Kampf group, which is basically just putting him as in charge but in name only, as he's not actually going to be on the front. Also, Tanya finally requests her socks. And you thought that plot thread was going to be dropped. This is probably one of my favorite scenes in the books because it shows Tanya in an interesting way. More of a personal friendship where she isn't looking for personal advancement or how to best use her underlings. It also shows Lurgan's come to understand Tanya more as a person, that they can kind of develop this sort of friendship, at least a semi-professional one, while also letting her set the record straight on some of the early misconceptions he had about her. I wish this series had more moments like this where Tanya wasn't just some goal-driven machine looking for the best outcome of every single moment of her life. Like, God, just let her be a person for a bit. So with that settled, it's the Empire's turn to go on the offensive. But Tanya's told she and her battalion have to reinforce a flank, while the rest of her Kampf group defends and supports other areas. This is really just to showcase the Federation's approach to mages now that they're actually being deployed on the front. So the Federation created a new sort of computation orb that's actually so stupid it's brilliant. It allows for strong defensive shells and firepower at the expense of mobility. Essentially, they made air tanks. So Tanya's battalion is having a hard time punching through and hurting these guys to the point that they think they may be invincible. That is until, in frustration, Tanya fires a full power sniping formula at one and actually punches through. So hey, they just cracked the strategy there, just hit them really hard. So they repel the mages and take an orb back for study, where in a report we learn they're not suitable for the Empire's operations because, as we already saw, they're slow and lack maneuverability. And that's pretty much what the Empire cares about most, is versatility in its computation orbs. Also, it might be kind of a key weakness that you just kind of need to hit it really hard. That's not difficult. Lurgan heads over to Ildoa to meet with Gasman to officially kick off the unofficial peace negotiations as liaison for the Empire. They talk about terms, where the Federation wants an unconditional surrender with no reparations and no concessions of territory. But the Empire here wants reparations, on top of local referendums held in the occupied territory so the Council for Self-Governance can become buffer states between the Federation and the Empire. Gasman tells him the Empire is being too greedy, but the Empire won't budge. Because, that's the bare minimum they need to keep their country under control. So it's basically we'll work on it from there. And Lurgan leaves for the Empire Embassy, silently wishing for the army to pull off an astounding victory, as one more major win would strengthen the Empire's position. Over to the General Staff, things are shaky, but at least looking up for the Empire in the east. Their organized retreat to solidify their position worked, and they rebuffed the Federation's general offensive. But they're just barely holding it together, meaning they're in a prime spot for a counteroffensive. Great. Here's the thing. This fight on the east is all just to secure a better bargaining position in the backroom peace negotiations where the Federation is trying to show the Empire they're losing, while the Empire needs to score a big victory to say they're actually close to winning the whole war, so the Federation better sue for peace. Yeah, basically we're playing poker with war. Zetor predictably wants to settle in and build their strength, but Rudersdorf knows the Federation isn't in a good spot, so he's pushing for a big counteroffensive. The plan is to pull the lines together quickly while the Federation is advancing and let them make their own noose, since they're out of their base so the Empire can encircle the whole army and squeeze it in. Back on over to the front, Calandro meets up with Tanya's unit and the two feel each other out. The obvious shock of a little girl leading a conf group wanes quickly, but the real butting of heads comes when Tanya tries to issue orders, and Calandro asks questions about military regulations and laws pertaining to those orders. Oh yeah, he's gonna have a fun time here. Tanya hates this, of course, because she just wants the dude out of her way so she can do her job, but due to his rank, she can't just well kick him out. But this is where Calandro learns just how ignorant Ildoa is of the war, where they assumed it's pretty standard stuff like they had on the Rhine, but the Federation is so vast that trenches are impossible, and small field encounters, hit-and-run tactics, punctuated by sieges of towns are the main conflict, which is, if you think back, against the rules of war on land laid out in Volume 2. Don't you love that? We're making callbacks. That argument resurfaces here, but this time Tanya uses the Communist Party as a shield, saying everything in the Federation is state property, so it's fine to bomb, while typical targets for being spared like churches are non-existent, due to the party's anti-theist policies. So quite the shock when he sees Tanya's unit blow up a former church before his eyes. After the ethics and legality argument is done and Tanya lays out the reality for him, Calandro is sort of stunned by how insane the war actually is. Also, Tanya's unit is now pulling back. They got orders to retreat. And just to confirm why solidifying the lines is a good idea, her unit gets hit with artillery out of fucking nowhere. Artillery using mage observers, who happen to be Empire. Yes, she accidentally got fired on by her own army, because no one can tell the difference between friend or foe when the lines are all mixed up and in disarray. So Tanya and her unit piece together the conflicting orders of advance one day and retreat the next, while green troops are being thrown on the front lines. Must mean the Empire's preparing for a big counteroffensive. Now on over to Lurgan telling Gasman the Empire's reply to the terms Ildoa was offering, that being essentially an unconditional surrender. The Empire tells them to eat shit. That's their actual word choice. I love it. Gasman tells Lurgan that if the Empire just gave up on establishing buffer states, the Federation would agree to peace instantly, but the Empire's having none of that because that's their future national security right there. It's framed that while the interior line strategy was developed in response to their geopolitical situation, i.e. the encirclement by hostile nations, they're actually dealing with essentially PTSD, that this fear keeps their officials up at night, so they're sure as shit not going back to that. Lurgan reaffirms that they won't back down, and Gasman tells them, hey, you guys are about to get your asses kicked over there. And this is where Lurgan reminded them that they've won in the west, the north, and cleaned up the south, and the Federation is the one remaining threat on land. And besides, whose soil are they fighting on again? That's right, the Federation's, which is why they're about to enact Operation Iron Hammer to get that last victory to assert their supremacy in the war. Meanwhile, the General Staff is putting the final touches on Iron Hammer, where they're dropping an incredibly experienced commando unit behind enemy lines to watch a key bridge that they'll blow up if the Federation tries to retreat. The plan, in its entirety, is to have a force in the center push hard into the encircled Federation army, squeezing them until they're split in two, and then crush them against a natural barrier like a river. So they're effectively capturing the whole army in one fell swoop. So Tanya's group is given the orders to be the hammer in this operation. With her pioneering the idea of the mage unit riding tank decent, they can sneak through the entire war zone without anyone noticing them. So when they meet up with the commandos who had the bridge rigged, Tanya gets the orders to sniff out the Federation Army's HQ on site, which she does, while, of course, ends up bumping into enemy mages. Not the, multinational unit though. Mary is, conspicuously absent from this volume. Won't see me crying about that. But the mages that pop up aren't that big of a deal, since her unit's used to dealing with the new orbs by now. Her unit finds the big HQ looking thing, which Tanya says isn't HQ because she's so paranoid she thinks it's a trap. Oh, and it turns out she was right too. Of course. And with no real reason, besides she feels like it is. In response, her unit finds the real one, and they bomb it hard. However, here's the issue. The Federation is still standing strong at this point, even without a command. Well, retreating strong, I guess, as in it's an organized retreat, without the means to organize, which is super weird. Turns out before they got blown up, they issued the orders to follow their direct superiors' orders and retreat. Meanwhile, some of these units are acting as a bulwark to protect the others retreating, and trying to punch through the encirclement, which they're doing somehow. Don't ask me. But in the end, after Tanya takes out multiple hotspots of command activity, and the encirclement somehow mostly holds with only a few units escaping, the Empire can declare victory, because they captured the majority of their field army. That's a big one, since they effectively wiped out the Federation's forces. Over to Loria, who's looking at the aftermath of the battle and is pretty disappointed, since he pushed for improved supply lines, more soldiers, and better equipment, only to get another big failure. Even he sees the writing on the wall at this point, that the war is as good as over. Or is it? While looking over the reports, he also sees a translated newspaper from the Empire, which makes him smile. You see, the Empire is absolutely thrilled with their victory, and thinks nothing will stop them from taking the Federation for all it's worth. They're now drunk on the concept of excessive victory, where they went from a standstill in the north and west simultaneously, to a win over the Alliance, blowing through the Rhine to conquer the Republic, and now they've captured the entire Federation army. They're looking unstoppable, so obviously they're due for a big payout, right? That's gambler's logic. So Loria is smiling since he knows the war will continue for a long time now, since he's privy to the terms the Empire is seeking, and knows his country isn't at its limits yet. Over to Mary and Drake, who are still in the former Alliance, helping the Resistance members. I'm just mentioning that they get a scene, basically just reacting to their defeat, which Mary gets pissed about their leaving, but ultimately just goes with Drake because what choice does she have? And she gets unreasonably pissed off at the mention of Tanya. So pretty much any other scene she's in. Over to Tanya's unit, celebrating their victory. The war is over and she's probably the happiest she's ever been in this franchise. Calandro congratulates her and the Empire for their remarkable victory, but Tanya understands it isn't over until the ink is dried, and they're still technically at war. Now over to the General Staff, who are pretty damn overwhelmed at their win. Rudersdorf comments what it would take to hypothetically keep the war going if it had to which Zetor flat out says they'd be taking supplies from enemy territory, literally looting, which is foreshadowing for the future of the series, but I digress. The ceasefire is basically assured since they beat the Federation so soundly, and the two are just trying to figure out the terms to present to the Supreme Council. Speaking of, they meet with them later that day. Zetor and Rudersdorf sit down expecting some praise, but instead get their peace deal thrown right back at them, and berated for being incompetent? What the fuck? The terms are not what the ruling body of the Empire was expecting, and they want money, because this war has driven their country into the ground financially, and they're looking at a global depression from the fallout. To save their own asses, the Federation needs to split the bill for the whole war. But, that won't happen. The terms are a ceasefire and elections in the newly liberated areas. So Rudersdorf and Zetor basically just sit there getting screamed at about how the terms are ass, while they try to calmly explain that the Empire is at its limits from a manpower and supplies standpoint. But that victory they pulled off was basically too good that it convinced everyone that they can even do better.
meaning the Supreme Council wants another victory. Keep winning until we get the terms and money. And that's the Supreme Council expressly stating that it's speaking on behalf of the Imperial family and the people of the Empire. So the army really doesn't have a choice here. And our last little check-in is with Lurgan, cracking open a bottle of the good shit he's been saving since the war started. When it ended. Everyone in the embassy is drunk off their ass, and Lurgan is pretty sloshed too. He decodes the message about the meeting with the Supreme Council, and promptly in shock over the response the Empire got, that the Supreme Council wishes to renegotiate with much greater concessions. Yeah, all their hard work over the last 2 volumes, down the drain. The volume ends with Tanya looking over the river she fought to keep the Federation from crossing, remarking how excited she is for the ceasefire, eventual peace, and the end to the war. Her future is certainly looking bright.
Yeah, that's good for a laugh. So that's our volume, and the end of the second major arc of this franchise. To be honest, I'm gonna praise this volume a lot because, well, this is just sort of peak Tanya right here. This volume has a good mixture of frontline combat. Not descriptions of the fighting per se, but more the ebb and flow of battle, as well as capturing the confusion. But also nails the more interesting parts of the light novels I actually enjoy, parts that we're not going to get in the anime. Like field reports, backroom deals, multiple character perspectives, and taking all the dangling threads from the previous few volumes, and tying them all together in a nice little package. It still has its fair share of hiccups that the other books have, like long-winded narration and massive tirades, but this book sort of distills what works in the series in a way that we haven't seen in a few volumes now. You know, with Tanya being in charge of a pretty large unit, she hasn't really been on the front lines, so seeing her actually out there again is a good change of pace. One that won't be a stranger in the next volume to come. Let's talk some about what worked in this book, and what the takeaway is.
One of the biggest problems in the Eastern Theater is that it isn't like the Rhine. We had fairly defined set pieces in that whole conflict, with constant artillery barrages and infantry attacks, while the 203rd fought for air superiority. Everyone had a goal, or a purpose with an aim. That whole dynamic evaporates in the later volumes, where Tanya spends 3 whole books being flung around the east and north on a whim. That has a negative impact on the story being told here, since it's sort of hard to understand what Tanya's even fighting for, or when she's not even in an area long enough to have a clear mission. When she and the 203rd were up on their first tour in the north, she was there for battles to strike key points. On the Rhine, she was actively holding the front, defending the rear, or still striking key points, like the enemy HQ. But on the east, she's wandering around defending some unknown plot of dirt we get no description of against waves of endless infantry, until it turns into waves of tanks, artillery, and I guess the occasional mage. There's no real stakes or personality to the combat, like we had on the previous fronts. I'm not just saying that to nostalgia bait the earlier volumes, but more that those succeed in an aspect that these later volumes fail at, which is particularly why the author is sending Tanya back to those familiar areas. And wow, get this, Volume 7 is where it struck out and found its voice for the Eastern Theater. Yeah, that's right, sieges.
Which is astounding how long it took him to notice, since one of the bloodiest, dirtiest, and ostensibly worst battles in World War II was fought on the Eastern Front. You know, the damn near 6-month siege of Stalingrad? For real? Why aren't you taking more inspiration from that? Well, he does a little later on, but we'll get into that when the time comes. We really haven't had a staple to identify with. The North had battle over waters, the West had trench warfare, the South had deserts, and Dacia was just a laughingstock. So make the East about sieges. What else screams war of attrition besides that?
Finding what the author wants to do is great, but it's just a damn shame it took him 4 volumes into the arc to figure it out. Hell, and it's the last book in the arc at that. I understand that this is a capstone to a series of events that began in Volume 4, with this attack on the Federation capital and following Tanya through her journey in becoming a commanding officer, learning from her mistakes, and understanding the organization she follows is flawed. That's a good plotline, but through that story we're missing a sense of identity for the world besides Tanya's in a nebulous region doing a nebulous activity before getting recalled to another nebulous area with another nebulous activity. Though it does manage to capitalize on all the foreshadowing it hinted at in previous books. I talked about back in Volume 4 how Tanya was going to have that little stunt of hers come back to bite her in the ass by whipping up that level of nationalistic fervor. And hey, it finally did, because she made the Empire look invincible. and continues to do so by being instrumental in their victories. Hell, just about everything in this book is handled better than the previous two, which is why I mentioned that it felt like the author knew his starting point for this arc, with Tanya bombing Moskva and ending with this sweeping victory over the army, but honestly didn't know what to do in between. Foreshadowing is properly paid off here. Characters have more organic relationships, but most importantly, there's a good flow to the events. Tanya starts off in a tough spot, but the Empire, and her by proxy, are in a tougher one that builds into this massive climactic battle where they pull off this huge victory, and that leaves them riding high and looking forward to peace, until the ominous air of the Supreme Council not approving that deal hangs overhead, with an ending dripping with irony by Tanya unwittingly looking forward to the future. That's something I complained about. In this volume, as well as the next, managed to keep up a solid flow of emotion for the audience to carry them through the story, instead of just flatlining on depression.
I get enough of that from my real life, thank you.
Mary's absence in this particular volume was barely noticed, until she showed up for her brief scene. This character shows some growth in the coming volumes, but honestly, she's been completely superfluous to the plot to this point, and even in the next volume she's not really there to impact anything, which really just makes me feel like Mary is part of the bloat in the word count to pad this series out. Hey, I got it, let's add a character the audience can identify with, but make her unlikable and annoying who disrupts the flow of scenes. Yeah, that's smart. My point is, her barely featuring in this volume was appreciated as opposed to missed, and that's about all that really needs said about her part in this story.
I praised Volume 7 quite a bit in this video because it's a good end to the arc, by wrapping up relevant plot points while seeding new ones. In the end, it's a solid direction for the series to shoot off with. Well, this is usually where I plug my teas for the next volume, and while I've read Volume 8, it's right here as a matter of fact, we're going to take an extended break from this franchise, mostly because Volume 9 is due sometime by the end of the year. I hope. Sorry, the date keeps getting pushed back, it's hard for me to plan. And god, it's just a lot easier to dive into these when I've read the full arc, and we're one book into it, so we're gonna have to take a break. That doesn't mean I'm done looking at light novels, however, because, well, the next book series is one about someone who just loves books. We're getting meta on this bitch. But hey, for now, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also check out my Discord with a link down in the description. If you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks, like voting on what I do next. Speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Nadeshko for their continued support. Thanks for watching.